Cycling for me has never been about the bikes. They've only ever been the prerequisite tool. I do not see just a bike race, I see riders on heroic journeys and warriors doing battle. At one point, cycling was the most popular sport in Europe because newspapers told magnificent tales about epic races and crafted the great champions into legends. But with the advent of television, cycling lost some of its mystique, and that golden age of journalism and narration has perished. So now let us try to return some romance to the beautiful sport. Let us praise and give glory to phenomenal performances to be remembered for decades to come. Let us dwell on the moments that inspire and move us. Let us chronicle the rise and fall of heroes. Let us chart these life-changing journeys, these cycling odysseys. A primer of the cycling calendar. Well, if you are new to the whole sport of cycling, rightly you must be asking, what are these teams and riders training for? Everyone in the world knows the Tour de France is in July, but surely preparation and early season races for the big event need not start in January and February. Surely they must be training for other earlier objectives. Let this report serve as a broad sweeping narrative laying out the biggest objectives of the cycling calendar. Surely the race is not to be missed this season. The calendar is long and bloated. At points, there seems no rhyme or reason to it. Overall, it is difficult to string together a season-long narrative besides the fact that we know what the biggest objectives are, and we can measure or debate who has racked up the greatest haul of placings and winnings. In a nutshell, the season is divided into arguably 4 to 6 parts. The early season races, the spring classics, while simultaneously the spring stage races run concurrently, the summer dominated by the Grand Tours and their proper warm-up races, and the season is closed out with the World Championships and Fall Classics. It is now time to begin the review of these large blocks of the season. Fear not when I list them out at too rapid-fire a pace. Each will be covered more in depth when that part of the season is upon us. Trust in my priming skills. If you are new to the sport of cycling, I shall hold your hand through the whole season so that you may experience cycling's full beauty and epicness. For the past 2 decades, the season has begun properly down under. There are a few Australian crits in the Australian Nationals for the time trial and road race, but the season is officially underway with the Tour Down Under. The Tour Down Under is about a 6-day stage race around the burnt orange hills of Adelaide, taking place in the middle of January. This race has the prestige to be a World Tour race, meaning the World Tour teams, the top echelon of teams in the sport, are required to send a roster of riders to compete in the race. The Tour Down Under is now over 2 decades old, an ancient age for a stage race outside of Europe, and has had that World Tour status for years now. The World Tour teams care about placing well at World Tour races. Thus, they usually send a squad of 6 to 8 riders already on decent form who are preparing for the Spring Classics to come in March and April. The teams shall usually have their squad around a few weeks before or after the Tour Down Under to do some Southern Hemisphere warm weather training. And so, the racing is always fast and hard already in January. For many Australians come into the race already on top form, having spent all winter training in Australia, and they are motivated to do well on home roads. And yet, despite the demanding racing, the length of the stages are short and everything is based closely to Adelaide, meaning the riders stay in the same hotel all race. Thus, with all these perks, the cycling season starts in mid-January with this premier early season event. Surely, if not for the Tour Down Under, the official start date would be much later. The Tour Down Under starts off the season with a bang, but not everyone opens up there, and thus the other opening races shall be listed. The Tour Down Under has required more explanation to explain that hallowed World Tour status and for why or how a traditional summer sport would start in January. It is the first big league race of the year, whereas almost all of the rest of the early season is much more low-key, much more of rust duster affairs. Following the Tour Down Under, there is Cadel Evans' one-day race in Melbourne a week later, which is growing in prestige. The week after that, there is the Jayco Herald Sun Tour, which is a less prestigious race, but still attracts a handful of World Tour teams. But by then, the calendar is already getting crowded. There's usually 1 or 2 week-long stage races going on in South America to represent the southwestern hemisphere at the same time as the Tour Down Under. The races themselves change or go under too often to annually keep track of. But whichever Vuelta San, insert Spanish saint name here, is going on, it will attract a handful of World Tour teams to send over their riders. The appeal of the South American races is the same as the Australian ones, an escape from winter's cold clutches. And in recent years, a new crown jewel South American early season race has been created. In mid-February, the 6th stage, Tour Colombia, has been held for a handful of years now. It seems every citizen in Colombia turns out to watch the race pass on the roadside, and it is a sight to behold, especially because most of the greatest Colombian riders and their teams turn up at the start line in the hopes of winning in front of the home fans. Meanwhile, over the past 15 years, cycling has forayed into unexpected regions of the world. The oil-rich Middle Eastern countries have all set up a race. The first was the Tour of Qatar, known as great training grounds for riding in the brutally hard crosswinds. Perfect training for the spring classics, but it has not been contested in recent years. Others have popped up, like the Tour of Oman, a Saudi tour, and the 4-day stage races of the Dubai Tour and the Tour of Abu Dhabi have combined to form a week-long UAE tour, incorporating stages from both cities. Yes, with the absence of the Qatar stage race, the UAE Tour is now attracting many of the greatest teams in the world. For such a race, has great weather for late February, has ample opportunities for the sprinters to get early season victories, has actually found a few proper climbs for the GC men to stretch their legs, and has been given World Tour race status. With so many warm weather options, the traditionally European early season races have diminished in prestige. And yet, since the majority of the World Tour races take place in Europe and all riders are based there for most of the year, the early French and Iberian races still attract good fields. The Mallorca Challenge races at the end of January are truly rust-dusting affairs. The Valenciana 5-day stage race usually has a bit of higher competition, even if most of the riders are still simply stretching the legs for the first race of the season. The same goes for the old French Étoile des Bessages, the Tour des Alpes Maritimes at Duvar, and the newer Tour de la Provence as well. Finally, the overlapping Volta ao Algarve in Portugal and the Ruta del Sol in Andalusia are each 5 stages and finish the week before opening weekend in Belgium. These and the UAE Tour close out the early season period of the calendar. After these races, begin the Spring Classics. Though the early season racing can be good viewing, and at points sometimes there are 3 or 4 races being broadcast on the same day from different corners of the world, all know these are more preparation preseason races for a racer to find their legs or to indicate a rider's current form and establish some peloton-wide benchmark for the main objectives to come for the season. And the main objectives start with the Spring Classics, the second phase of the season. The Spring Classics begin with Belgium's opening weekend on the last Saturday and Sunday of February. Omloop het Nieuwsblad on Saturday and Kuurne Brussels Kuurne on Sunday. Before the Tour Down Under and the wealth of Southern Hemisphere races in January and February, these opening Belgian classics were not so prestigious. Even they were only still rust dusters. But nowadays, by opening weekend, 90% of the World Tour riders have already begun their season, and these are the first 2 cobbled classics that have a whole breed of specialty rider that can win them. The Saturday after opening weekend, the cycling world shifts its eyes to Italy, to the classic that is by far the youngest and yet no longer the new kid on the block. I speak of Strade Bianche, meaning white roads. The teenage race takes place around Tuscan Siena. The landscapes are beautiful, the white gravel is unique, and the finish into Siena's town square is jaw-dropping and perfect. Just the day after, on the Sunday comes one of the oldest and most prestigious stage races on the calendar, the 8-day Paris-Nice. The race is just what it sounds like. From the outskirts of Paris, when it is harsh and cold in mid-March, the riders make their way towards the Mediterranean sea haven of Nice. In ideal years, the race lives up to its nickname, the Race to the Sun. In the 1980s and before that, such a race was still only a warm-up and rust duster for many of the big names. Meanwhile, strangely at the same time, a rival Italian week-long stage race, Tirreno Adriatico, the race between the two seas, takes place across the Apennines of Italy from coast to coast. Why have two prestigious World Tour stage races overlap? This conflict highlights perfectly the bloatedness of the calendar, but the races are truly in competition. Both wish to be the premier final tune-up race for the first monument of the year, Milan-San Remo. It is prestigious and rewarding to win a general classification or a stage of Perrier or Tirreno Adriatico, but many riders participate to hone or fine-tune their form to be optimally ready for San Remo. For Milan-San Remo is one of the 5 monuments of cycling, the 5 most prestigious one-day classics in the world to win. To win just once simply makes your career, and Milan-San Remo lives up to its name, going from the unofficial capital of northern Italy all the way to the Riviera Italian town near the French border. In ancient days, it was this race that was the official start of the season, an honor Amla Pet Newsblad now holds. San Remo is the longest race on the calendar at around 300 kilometers, and it is the only monument the sprinters have a chance to win. With San Remo completed, the Italian interlude is over for all the Classics riders who return to Belgium immediately. For this is when the rest of the cobbled one-day classics begin to come thick and fast. The Friday after San Remo, usually the last weekend of March, comes the cobbled E3 Classic. The sponsor name changes, but all know it is one of the big classics to win. 2 days later, on the last Sunday of March, is Ghent-Wevelgem, another cobbled classic of very high prestige, and one where the crosswinds most notoriously rage. Meanwhile, in Spain, the World Tour Volta a Catalunya, the 3rd oldest stage race in the world, is taking place simultaneously throughout this week. The race's high mountains usually attract a good haul of GC riders honing or testing their form against the men that shall be their rivals in the Grand Tours to come. After a midweek final tune-up cobbled race comes the first Sunday in April, and everyone in Belgium knows what that day holds. Yes, it is the Belgian Super Bowl, the Ronde van Vlaanderen, the Tour of Flanders. All the cobbled classics have been riding around many of the same roads and over famous cobbled climbs, but this is what they progress towards and culminate in. This is the one every Belgian wants to win, as the entire region of Flanders watches. The Tour of Flanders is the 2nd monument of the year, and to see all the crowds and the fierce racing, truly a viewer can see why it is a special race, can see why it is one of the 5 monuments. Flanders is the start of cycling's Holy Week, a jest of a name, for occasionally it overlaps with the real Holy Week from Palm Sunday to Easter. During this cycling Holy Week, yes indeed, there is another week-long World Tour stage race in Spain, the Tour of the Basque Country, sometimes called País Vasco, or recently, Itzulia. It is a stage race as prestigious as Paris-Nice, Tirreno Adriatico, and the Volta a Catalunya. To win a stage or the race overall is an accomplishment in itself, but additionally, the Basque Country is known for their shorter and punishingly steep climbs that are fantastic preparation for the Ardennes Classics to come only a few weeks later. Midweek after Flanders comes the Scheldeprijs Classic. It is not as difficult as the others, and thus it usually attracts the best sprinters in the world and is known as the or one of the unofficial Sprinters World Championships. Then, finally, on the Sunday after Flanders comes the Queen of the Classics, the Hell of the North, the 3rd monument of the season, the most prestigious one-day race in the world, Perrier Bay. It is the final cobbled classic of the season, but unlike the Flandrian ones, this one takes place in the north of France over much rougher cobbles that make the Flemish ones appear to be child's play. This race is always a spectacle, and almost always lives up to the superlatives it has received. After Roubaix, the spring classics feel to be winding down, but the climbers still need to have their fun. There is a midweek Brabantse-Pijl race, and the Sunday after Perrier Bay comes the first Ardennes Classic, the Amstel Gold Race. Despite the grouping, Amstel does not actually take place in the Ardennes, but instead in the only hilly part of the Netherlands. It is a hybrid race that suits the classicsmen that can dominate the cobbles, or in some editions, a climber that can sprint will take the victory. Midweek, the prestigious Flèche Wallonne finishes up the mighty steep wall known as the Mur de Huy, the Wall of Huy. And after 2 months of spring classics and stage races coming thick and fast on almost a daily basis, This portion of the calendar comes to an end with the most prestigious and grueling of the Ardennes Classics, arguably the oldest race on the whole cycling calendar, the fourth monument, Liège-Bastogne-Liège, often won by a springy punchier or even an outright Grand Tour climber. Thus ends the most intricate part of the season to describe. But the phases of the season still do not even divide evenly there. During the Ardennes Classics week, there is another World Tour week-long stage race going on in Switzerland, the usually bad-weathered Tour de Romandie. The Tour de Romandie is by far the biggest and last preparation race before the Giro d'Italia, the Tour of Italy, the first 3-week Grand Tour of the year. A week or two after Romandie, depending on the year, the Giro dominates the entire month of May. There are other minor tune-up races than Romandie, and in the past, the week-long Tour of California has been running during the Giro's second week, but all of that is sideline news compared to the second biggest race in the entirety of the sport. In a way, the Giro kicks off the long cycling summer. It sets the tone of cycling constants in one's life. The Giro sets the tone for the summer of the Grand Tours. The hype and sense of Odyssean adventure are fulfilled, and as far as passion and character are concerned, the Giro almost certainly has more of both than any other race on the calendar, including the Tour de France. But when the Giro finishes, eyes begin to shift immediately towards the Tour. Usually, a week after the Giro finishes, the ultimate Tour tune-up race, the Criterium du Dauphiné, takes place. It is a World Tour week-long stage race on the same level of prestige as Romandie or Catalonia or Paris-Nice. But it is noteworthy that most of the GC riders here will all have at least one eye on the Tour 3 weeks later. The Dauphiné is the ultimate preparation for the Tour because it is run by the same organizers. They even treat it like a mini tour and run the stages over some of the exact same climbs to come 1 month later in the Grand Bocale. But the Dauphiné is not the only premier Tour prep race. 3 weeks before the Tour begins, the Dauphiné finishes and the brutal 9-day Tour de Suisse, the Tour of Switzerland, starts up. The Tour de Suisse has a long history, and it is perhaps more of a jewel to win in its own right than most of the week-long World Tour stage races. Or that is because, it is a very brutal race. Usually the weather does not cooperate, many of the stage profiles are extremely tough, there are no easy days here, and it finishes only 2 weeks before the Tour than the perhaps ideal 3 weeks like the Dauphiné. A week after Suisse, and 1 week before the Tour, all the European countries host their national time trial and road race championships to decide which riders will don the country's flag as a jersey for a whole year. The week after this, on the first Saturday of July, give or take a week during an Olympic or World Cup year, the Tour de France, the second 3-week Grand Tour of the year, begins. It is the largest and most important race on the calendar, for most sporting fans around the world have heard rumor of its existence. To win a stage of the Tour, or any Grand Tour for that matter, is an extremely big deal. A stage of the Giro or Vuelta is likely only a step below winning the GC of a prestigious week-long stage race like Paris-Nice or the Tour of the Basque Country. But to win a stage of the Tour, if it is a memorable stage or one in the highest mountains, that is arguably a bigger deal than winning an entire week-long World Tour stage race outright. But so much has been written of the Tour, we can quickly move on to the lesser-known races. After the Tour, all the riders make appearance fees showing up at fixed, local, untelevised criteriums in Belgium, Holland, and northern France. But many other real World Tour races continue. The Saturday after the Tour is the hilly or even mountainous one-day classic of San Sebastian, named after the city in the Basque Country that hosts the race. Though cycling fans are tuckered out from watching racing by this point, this is never one to miss. On the Sunday is the Ride London race in Britain, also another good show. And around this time, too, would be the Olympic road race when it is such a year. 2 weeks after the Tour, many smaller 4 or 5 day stage races start springing up from Norway's Arctic Circle to the deserts of the Tour of Utah. The most prestigious race around this time is the Tour of Poland week-long World Tour stage race, sometimes used as a last preparation for the Vuelta a España. The ever-changing Benelux Tour, another World Tour week-long stage race, takes place around this time too, racing through the Netherlands and Belgium, reminding us all of the spring classics that felt so long ago by this point. And somewhere or other, the European Championships are squeezed in as well to award some rider with the jersey of blue stripes and golden stars. But by mid-August, whether the cycling community is ready or not, the Vuelta a España, the Tour of Spain, begins. It is the third Grand Tour of the year, and thus the third biggest race on the cycling calendar, behind the Tour and the Giro. For most of its history, the Vuelta was known as the little brother of the Grand Tours, but over the past decade or so, it has reinvented itself with relatively shorter stages and many brutally steep summit finishes throughout the race. Yes, the Vuelta has become a sprinter's nightmare. It does still fit to call it the Tour de France with a hangover, but it is low-key one of the best races on the calendar. For GC riders, this is the last major objective of the year, the Wild West Last Chance Saloon. The racing here is fiercer and more unbridled. For many riders, this is the very last race of the season, and they want to make it count, or salvage their season if they have yet to turn up many results. Others still use the Vuelta, too, as preparation for their last objective of the year. Yes, the World Championships that come 2 weeks after the Vuelta's finish. If riders are tuning up for Worlds but do not attend the Vuelta, they will probably race either the week-long Tour of Britain that usually overlaps at some time with the Vuelta, or they will travel to Canada for the two intense hilly one-day races, the GP Montreal and GP Quebec City, both taking place 2 days apart. And with that, the cycling summer comes to an end, and only the brief autumn is finally left. 2 weeks after the Vuelta, at the end of September, the World Time Trial and Road Race Championships take place. A different site is selected every year for Worlds. Sometimes the course is in flat Denmark, where the sprinters have their fun. Sometimes the course is in mountainous Austria, where a proper climber gets a rare chance at glory. Usually the course is neither extremely mountainous nor extremely flat, and it takes a rider of great endurance that can at least somewhat climb but also sprint to win the race. Worlds is not one of the 5 monuments. It is in a category of its own, and it is extremely special to win. For the winner of the World Championships gets to wear the rainbow jersey for a whole year until the next world champion is crowned. It is the special white jersey you have seen with the Olympic colored bands running across it. Blue, red, black, yellow, and green. And then after the World Championships, the season then really is clearly winding down, as it has been since the Vueltas or even the Tour's end. There are some minor one-day races in northern France and Belgium, but the only real block of racing left are the Fall Italian Classics and the one-off Perrier Tour. For 2 weeks after the World Championships, most of the top riders who have yet to start their off-seasons make their way to Italy to compete in one-day classics like Milano-Tirreno, the Giro dell'Emilia, Tre Valli Versi, Gran Piemonte, and others. They all whet the appetite for the 5th monument of the year, Il Lombardia, the Tour of Lombardy, nicknamed the Race of the Falling Leaves because of its mid-October date. In recent years, it has become one for the proper climbers, or even full-fledged GC riders coming off the Vuelta have performed extremely well. That same weekend is what was historically the sprinter's last big appointment, Perrier Tour in France. But alas, the race has lessened in prestige even as it attempts to reinvent itself by including wild gravel sectors. And with that, there may be one last week-long World Tour stage race in China or somewhere in the Far East in mid to late October. And then the road season is finally over. For those who are not yet sick of cycling, by that point, top-level cyclocross is already underway every weekend, and that can hold everyone over until the road season starts up again down under in January. Thus, the cycling calendar is covered in the quickest overview I could give. I'm sure it was too fast, and yet also too long for a primer. Did I not tell you the calendar was bloated, with little rhyme or reason? There is a banging opener in January, an assortment of objectives in the spring, the Grand Tours in the summer, and the end of season in the fall with Worlds and the Italian Classics. There are World Tour points available throughout, but there are no playoffs or season-ending championships. Why, the Tour, the biggest race in the sport, comes randomly 2/3 of the way through the season. Anyways, the point of this episode was to have a massive reference for how the whole calendar fits together. But other previews shall surely be provided for the rest of the season as well, where the character and details of each race shall be described more in-depthly. But for now, my energy is spent, and I must end this laborious affair describing the beautifully bounteous and bloated calendar of cycling.